You can't understand power in Australia without understanding what role the Australian plays.
Robert Manne, you've written a new quarterly essay called Bad News about Murdoch's Australian. I recently read that Chris Mitchell quoted you as saying that the Australian's the best newspaper in the country. Do you still think that?
Well, best is not adequate to what I think about the Australian. I think, for me, it is the most important paper for all sorts of reasons I can go into. It's also probably the only paper that is interesting to someone who's has an intellectual interest. The papers that it rivals, like Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, have to appeal to a much broader kind of readership, a readership that spans from the intelligentsia, let's say, to a kind of audience that wants more stuff about entertainment and sport. So that from that point of view, it's the sort of the paper of the intelligentsia and the paper of the political class, as I call it. And from that point of view, what I did say when I interviewed Chris Mitchell was that if I was on a desert island and was only allowed one paper, from Australia, it would be the Australian. But the word best doesn't quite cover what I mean.
And what was it that prompted you to devote an entire quarterly essay to the Australian?
Well, there are two reasons. In the long term, I've thought, really for years, that you can't understand power in Australia without understanding what role the Australian plays. In other words, I've thought it's the engine room for a certain kind of Anglophone conservatism, and has had enormous power in influencing opinion and, in fact, playing a role in our politics. So that's been my general reason, and I've thought for years it should be analysed, and it hasn't been at all, really. The second reason was that I was, around about September 2010, I took the view that they'd played a very big role in destroying the Rudd government, and also I was shocked by an editorial comment where it was said that the Australian thought the Greens should be destroyed at the ballot box, and it was clear then the paper intended to play a role in that destruction. And that something clicked. I thought they'd played a very bad role in the area of climate change for many years, but now they were going to take on the party that is at the avant-garde of the Australian struggle against climate change. And so I snapped at that point.
And this was obviously, just to clarify, long before Murdoch's problems started in the UK.
Strange to be such a change of atmosphere during the period of writing. Trouble for the Murdoch empire. In fact, that came relatively late in the writing process, when the research was finished, and it was strange to be such a change of atmosphere during the period of writing.
Why did you focus on the Australian rather than on News Limited generally? Because there is a similarity in their editorial lines in Australia.
Yes, there's a similarity. I mean, I think the key is, I think the Australian is by far the most important of the News Limited papers. Now, there's a big issue there because obviously the Herald Sun in Melbourne and the Daily Telegraph in Sydney reach the biggest audience. But the Australian is the values maker, and also the paper that sets the agenda for the other tabloids, has a much larger political gallery, part of the Canberra gallery, a much larger part is the Australian, but is read by politicians and public servants and business people and intellectuals much more than the other parts of the News Limited stable, and has an influence also on ABC, I think, in agenda setting. So it seems to me, my guess would be that if Rupert Murdoch was told that instead of 70% of the Australian press he was only allowed to have 10%, the bit that he would keep would include the Australian, because I think it's his major asset in this country.
Do you think the Murdoch influence is what has determined the character of the Australian?
That's a very good and difficult question. It's a good question and must be answered. In my view, in part, the central values of the Australian are the values of other parts of the Murdoch empire. To summarise, the two most important values are the assumption of American kind of hegemony in the world, the idea that America is the great power, the superpower, and a benevolent power, and a support for its fundamental foreign policy is at the centre of The Australian, and that comes from Murdoch. And secondly, it's a paper which doesn't interrogate what I call neoliberalism, or what others might call market fundamentalism. So the idea of American hegemony, the idea of market fundamentalism, are the values that I think come from the Murdoch empire. And you get a different version of that in the Wall Street Journal, or in Fox News, or in the Times of London and other parts of the Murdoch empire. On the other hand, and there's a question I put to a number of people, if the editorship of The Australian had remained in the hands of Paul Kelly, who had it up to the mid-90s, and hadn't passed to Chris Mitchell, then I asked many people, and I have my own answer to it, I think it would have been a very different paper. That is to say, I think Chris Mitchell, who is a strange person and a very kind of dominant person, has played a very big role in the trajectory of The Australian. And I'd say this finally, and I'm sure Murdoch is very happy about that. In other words, I think Mitchell is typical of the kind of editor that does very well under Murdoch's kind of regime.
So how would you describe The Australian's ideology and agenda on more specifically Australian matters now?
Well, you'd have to take issue by issue. I suppose the centre of The Australian is a deep hostility to something it thinks of as the left. It's a very ideological paper, more ideological than I think any newspaper I've encountered in history or in contemporary Australia. So that its anti-left is very fundamental to it in all sorts of ways. In foreign policy, it's invariably pro-American, invariably. In other areas of foreign policy, it is extremely pro-Israel and regards anyone with criticism. I regard myself as not an enemy of Israel, but a critic of Israel. It regards anyone who's critical of Israel even as somehow heretical. In terms of Aboriginal affairs, it is highly hostile to what it regards as the symbolic agenda of the left, and favours very strongly partly the Noel Pearson view of Aboriginal affairs, partly the Howard government and then the Rudd government's intervention. I suppose in moral matters it's conservative in general, although it is not anti-libertarian. It's not a religiously conservative paper, but it would approve various kind of moral old moral values.
Now, you're a man of the left, and The Australian's ideology is very much one of the right. I guess it's not surprising that you would differ with it on ideological terms. What more to your criticisms are there than simply a difference of political opinion?
Well, I don't think these things are matters of political opinion. I think they have to be argued out. And anyhow, I don't think it's true that I'm just a man of the left. I've actually had a very complicated political career, and many of the things that I believe are not things that the left believes. So I'm not as simple as that. But also, I think if you turn everything into this is just the view of the left, this is just the view of the centre, this is just the view of the right, then you can't get anywhere. Then, in other words, you have to take issue by issue and look at what ideology has done to that issue. And I think, for example, if you take the question of the Iraq War, the ideology of The Australian, which was pro-American and neoconservative, drove them into a position of, it seems to me, complete irrationality. But you can't say, well, look, the left had this view, the centre had this view, the right had this view, and there's nothing more to be said. You can look at the question of Iraq and then say what turned out to be right and what turned out to be realistic and so on. So my approach to all of these issues is to take them one by one, to look at what The Australian was saying and doing, to look at what reason or experience or what happened tells you about what they were saying and doing.
Do you think a newspaper has a right to take a stridently ideological position?
Well, right, of course, and they have a right to do anything. Freedom of expression is fundamental to our sort of society. But are they wise to take an ideological and a strident view? No. I think the world is such that almost every view that is strident or ideological will turn out to be problematic. And the reason it'll be problematic is that it will pretend, two reasons. It will pretend that issues are simpler than they are. In other words, it will simplify everything and not face up to the complexity of things. Secondly, it will tend, if it's ideological, it will tend to only look for the evidence that supports its ideology. In other words, what people I think instinctively value in journalism and in newspapers is something that we call fair and balanced reporting. But that means maintaining an unusually open mind. In other words, to be open to the evidence which might begin to make you think that something you'd previously believed didn't work. If you're ideological, and if you're a player, as I think the Australian is, and if you're, as it were, the word you used was strident, if you're any of those things, you will tend after a while to begin reporting that which suits your ideological position and to be, as it were, keeping at bay, holding out the evidence which pushes in the opposite direction.
I'll put to you a criticism that will obviously be fired at you in response to this essay. You argue that in the Australians' campaigns that the journalists appear to begin with an editorially determined conclusion and then seek out the evidence to support it. It'll inevitably be said that you're doing the same thing in your attacks on the Australian.
Well, it might be said, but I was a journalist at the Australian. That is, I wrote a column for the Australian in the mid-90s. I had no opposition to the paper at that point. And I haven't sort of begun to seek out the evidence for my position. I've read the paper consistently for 20 years or more and have formed a view as to what they've been saying and doing. So I can be criticised for getting it wrong, but I don't think I can be criticised for, as it were, prejudging them.
You divide the essay into several different issues or campaigns. The first one being on the fabrication of Aboriginal history, the Keith Windschuttle treatment. I guess it's worth noting with the Australian that they can't be accused of not caring about this issue, as in of trying to damage the welfare of Indigenous Australia. On the contrary, I think the Australian would they've devoted considerable editorial resources to Indigenous welfare and the reporting of it, and some of the journalists are in fact the best in Australia, I think, on this issue. Nicholas Rothwell, Paul Toohey, etc.
And Tony Koch is the other one I mentioned in the essay.
When it comes down to Windschuttle, doesn't your argument just boil down to a difference of historical interpretation?
Well, I clearly don't think it's just a difference of historical interpretation. It is a difference of historical interpretation, and clearly I think that, and I think I can show that his interpretation is, firstly, ludicrously wrong, and secondly, very damaging to the national debate on these questions.
How is their support of Windschuttle connected to the support that they put into the really great journalism of the likes of Nicholas Rothwell, Tony Koch?
I think that the reason that they got interested in Windschuttle was because Chris Mitchell is anti-left and sees the world in that framework, and that it's clear that the fabrication of Aboriginal history, Windschuttle's book, was a claim that the whole history of Aboriginal dispossession had been distorted systematically by left-wing fabricators. And the anti-left part of the Mitchell agenda meant that he was attracted to that. He's also, as he says himself, a contrarian, so he quite likes the contrarian positions when those contrarian positions are opposed to what he thinks as of the left. So I think he was attracted to Windschuttle from that point of view as an anti-leftist. I think that part of his sort of editorship is in tension with the other part of his editorship in regard to Indigenous questions, which is what I would call the Noel Pearson view. That is the need for Aboriginal people to get off welfare and to begin to become part of practical economy and to get educated and to stop drinking and so on. I think that with Mitchell is all genuine, and I think it's in tension with his support for the wind shuttle point of view. For example, Noel Pearson is very critical of wind shuttle, and I don't think Mitchell's newspaper reconciles these things. But I'd say this, that it seems to me that in the reporting of something like the intervention, the federal intervention in the Northern Territory, the Australian has been very one-sided. And it doesn't make it clear to its readers at all, firstly, that the Pearson view of the world is opposed by very large numbers of Indigenous people. You wouldn't get that from reading the Australian. Secondly, it tends to filter out the very great difficulties that have occurred, the unintended consequences and so on that have occurred as a result of the intervention. So again, because of its ideology, even if it's praiseworthy that it gives a lot of attention to Indigenous affairs, because of its ideology, it tends to filter out the contrary evidence. And I think it thus should be praised for giving a lot of time to Aboriginal affairs and should be criticised for what I call univocalism, only supporting the Pearson side, for keeping other Indigenous voices out of the paper, but also giving its non-Indigenous readers a quite distorted view of what's actually happening on the ground as a consequence of this major Commonwealth initiative.
I think one of the most notable elements of the Australians' persona or character at the moment is its treatment of climate change. On the one hand, it says that it agrees with a price on carbon and in the science of man-made climate change, but on the other hand, almost all of the articles in the paper would support the opposite position. What's behind these contortions, in your view?
Well, that's a very good and it's very difficult to answer. I think that there has been in two Western democracies since maybe 2007, 2008, a massive movement towards denying the centrality of climate change as an issue and to denying the science and to fighting against strong action on climate change. And the Australian has been an absolutely important element in that. So that its position it's complicated. On the one hand, it says that, and Chris Mitchell says all the time, that we do accept the basic science. If you read its editorials, that's just not true. Time and time again, as I've shown in the essay, it says the science isn't settled. It was incredibly pleased when this documentary by Durkin called The Great Global Warming Swindle was presented on television. It has given incredible voice to contrarian scientists or to cranks in its opinion page, outnumber the scientists of the consensus by 10 to 1. And its articles, as you say, have time and time again, even as late as a few days ago, attacked the scientists supporting the consensus and made bizarre claims about what's happening to the barrier reef or what's happening to sea level and so on and so forth. So it's sort of, it's a conflicted paper in which it places its emphasis on denying what it then publicly says it affirms.
And what's your view of Chris Mitchell's own personal opinion about man-made climate change?
Well, you have to put him on a psychiatrist's couch to work it out entirely. I think he doesn't know what he thinks in the end. I think he would like it to be shown that the work of the scientists is wrong, but he is not sure that that's the case. And so he, as it were, whenever there's a chance that something, when something appears which makes it seem likely that the consensual science is mistaken, he'll seize upon it. He would love it if a major scientific paper emerged which showed the consensus was wrong. As that doesn't emerge, he kind of protests that he does accept climate science, but his paper does everything to undermine that sense. So I think he's a conflicted individual. And I think he, in the end, he doesn't know himself what he believes.
You noted before that it was famously written in an editorial that the Greens should be destroyed at the ballot box. And this was seen as an important statement at the time. But haven't newspapers always endorsed political parties or not?
Well, I cannot recall it being said that a party should be destroyed at the ballot box. I mean, papers ought to be critical of political parties from time to time, but to, as it were, single-mindedly work towards the destruction of a party which has 1.5 million voters, I think is new. I think a lot of people got a bit of a shock because the sort of general belief about newspapers in Australia is that they don't see themselves as players trying to destroy or to make political parties. They see themselves as playing the role of analysing and reporting on national events. And, you might have the paper of the Communist Party saying we want to destroy the Liberal Party, or the party of the old DLP, the paper of the old DLP, News Weekly, saying we want to destroy the Communist Party. But to have a mainstream, in a way almost the most important mainstream newspaper, dedicating itself to the task of getting rid of one political party at the ballot box, I think struck a lot of people, including me, as novel, and I think pretty insidious.
You draw attention to the fact that it often seems like it's personal with the Australian, and not just on the Greens issue, like an obvious, almost personal, intense hatred of the Greens, but on issues relating to Julie Passetti, who was threatened with legal action for her tweeting, with Larissa Behrendt, and even a personal element in relation to the Australians' relationship with Kevin Rudd and his government. Could you sort of talk a little bit about how this has come to be?
It's very hard to say why, except to say that it's something within the character of the editor. David Marr said at one point the genius of Chris Mitchell, and I think genius is used in a slightly ironical way. The genius is to personalise everything. There are a number of people that Chris Mitchell sees himself in combat with, and there are a number of political positions that he's in combat with. And then it seems to me he wants to go to the end in fighting the battles with those people. So one element of this personalised aspect is that there are, if you know how to read The Australian, if you're politically savvy, you'll see these battles being fought on a daily basis. So there's a battle with Tim Flannery, there's a battle with Larissa Behrendt at one point, there's a battle with Simon Overland, the former police commissioner, there's a battle with the National Broadband Network, and with these battles are being fought all the time, and they become the sort of the hope of the editor that he will eventually triumph over personal enemies or policy enemies or party enemies. And so there's an element in which the paper is more the extension of the campaigning desires of the editor than any paper I've ever known in Australia. And so you can read the paper on a daily basis almost as seeing it as an expression of the editor, of the editor's political desires and angers. But also something which is unusual about the Australian is editorials are pushing that agenda all the time. Most editorials of most newspapers are boring, and most people who in their right mind don't read them. But the editorials of the Australian, if you get interested in the paper as a kind of pathology, the editorials are fascinating because they're a daily, what I call a daily early morning missive to the world, with the imprint of the editor-in-chief as the dominant force within them.
Would you advocate a sort of regulation to influence what's happening? As in, the Australian is a politically quite powerful organisation, as you note, and can be used in ways that are detrimental to democracy in Australia as a representative of of News Limited, for example. What would you advocate be done about this?
Well, it's an important question, a number of things. It's obviously open to people who are defamed to take legal action. And I think people who are defamed who have the resources should do that. Secondly, it's open to people who have been badly dealt with but not defamed to go to the Press Council and to complain. I think complaints should be raised. I don't myself think any regulations beyond that are in order. In other words, I'm not sympathetic to the idea that you can somehow find regulations that get rid of something called bias. I just cannot imagine that could be done. How the paper could be changed, I'd say two things might make a change. For years, The Australian has mocked and lampooned its two natural rivals in the media. One is the ABC, the other is the Fairfax Press. I think the ABC and the Fairfax Press should not allow themselves to be lampooned and ridiculed and criticised, what I call turn the other cheek. They almost never reply to these attacks. I think that's a mistake. They have the resources and the capacity to reply, and I think they should, because I think it gives the Australian too much credibility. They think they're lowering themselves if they answer the criticism, but I think they actually, as it were, encourage the Australian to continue on its crusade. So I'd like to see the ABC and Fairfax not turn the other cheek, but as it were, if they're being criticised, to show why those criticisms are wrong and to make criticisms of their own, to not be so passive. Even more importantly, I would like the Australians journalists to begin to speak out. In all the research I've done, there was only one occasion in which the journalists of the Australian complained about something that had happened on their paper. That was when there was a criticism of Janet Albrechtsen. It was called a rape, a gang rape, and the journalists of the Australian said this is out of order. Criticising a journalist is not an equivalent of raping a woman. But I haven't found any other public example in which the journalists at the Australian in recent times criticise what the paper has done. On the other hand, I'm absolutely convinced that many very senior journalists, really good journalists, are disturbed either about the irrationalism of the paper's position or about the bullying quality of what happens. And I reckon they should speak out. Firstly, internally, they should say to Chris Mitchell and to others, we don't like what today's paper has done. Or they should speak out publicly and take the risk. And I think that would change things pretty rapidly. And I know a lot of journalists feel these things, but it would take courage to do it. But as Julian Assange says, courage is contagious. And if one begins to act like this, then others might. And I think that would create a moral pressure inside the paper to curb its irrationalism and to curb its bullying nature.